After the last review for Kagero Deception 2, one thing I kept hearing from fans of the series is how much they loved the direction that the game took it in, and how Deception 3 was the entry they usually went back to for replays due to the changes that it made to the formula. Looking up videos from fans talking about their experience with the series, that same sentiment came up a lot too. At the same time, reviews from professional outlets that I came across while trying to find artwork would deride the third entry for a multitude of reasons, often stating that it felt more like a side grade with no visual or mechanical improvements. It made me curious what happened that caused this split, because the other two entries were largely met with the same response by most people, despite there being bigger differences between the two titles. Today we're going to look at the final entry in the PlayStation 1 era of the trap murdering series, in this review for Soul Mato, Deception 3, Dark Delusion. Deception 3 follows Reina, a girl who was kidnapped alongside her entire family because they're foreigners. Taken to an island where she's put in front of the king immediately orders the execution of her family in front of her and lets her live while she's locked up in a jail cell. A young boy named Marco gives her the ability to use traps, which ends up leading to a life of murder and political intrigue that she never asked for. The story is not the strongest point in Deception 3. The translation might be the worst that it's been in the entire series so far, and the bar has not been particularly high for this to begin with. Though that's not the only problem here. A lot of the story doesn't make sense in a lot of ways. The ability to put down traps is supposedly rare, so for Marco to be able to gift Reina with this is a bit odd by itself. But with how many attempts are made at Reina's life to get that pendant later on, it's really odd for the king to put her in jail at the start of the game instead of just killing her with the rest of her family and taking it then and there. I've seen people complain that Reina whines too much about having to murder, and that's the only thing I never really took issue with in the story. She only really does it in the first few stages of the game, at a time where she's obviously still in shock from her family being executed. A lot of the reasons for why things happen never get explained too well, so the political intrigue often feels like things just happen because the game's story needs them to. But Reina's transition from someone who kills to survive against her will, to someone who murders to get revenge, at least with one of the endings, makes sense. Where the main character of the first game was a blank slate to place yourself into, as his life was a tragic journey you saw from his perspective, and Millennia was a blank slate, raised to be an unquestioning murder weapon who could grow into more of a person as she got into contact with other human beings. Reina feels like a blank slate because she's just underwritten. She gets more dialogue than anyone in the series so far, but I couldn't really define her character as much as I could the other two lead characters. Story aside, the presentation has a pretty massive upgrade. Characters are now properly moving during cutscenes, and the camera angles and movements are a lot less stilted. There's a lot more detail to the textures and character models, though maybe a bit too much with how dark the game is. It's already hitting that spot where there's a lot more detail on a lot of the character models and textures than the PlayStation 1 can render properly, and the lack of brightness can make it even harder to make things out. The game looks especially ugly in screenshots because of this, but in motion it's honestly pretty good looking in a lot of places. The story not being anywhere near the quality of the one in Kagero would be pretty terrible if the story was the sole focus of Deception 3, and thankfully, it isn't. Where Deception 3 really shines is in the gameplay. While a lot of the core gameplay and mechanics are largely the same as they were in Kagero, a lot of tweaks were made to make the gameplay experience a lot more interesting over time. First of all, there's a trap crafting system in place now. Instead of a development tree you go over, you only unlock loose parts for the crafting screen that lets you create your own new traps. There's two types of modifiers, rings and emblems. Emblems tend to give an elemental or status change to a trap, while rings tend to modify how a trap activates or works. This system means you can give traps properties, like making them electric so that their electricity gets conducted through water, hurting everyone in it. Or a property that propels enemies upwards if they're hit by it, so they can get shoved into the ceiling traps. Or set them to detonate based on proximity or timers. There are so many more options here, it's really impressive it was all done on the PlayStation 1. Kagero had individual traps that could give effects like these, but it didn't allow you to put these effects on traps that you made yourself. On top of these options, you also set how powerful you want the trap to be, which can often modify how effective the special properties like knockback are, along with giving them a damage boost. This usually comes at the cost of increased cooldowns, but the new systems come down to giving a lot more creative freedom to the toolkit of the players, so if you think something is worth it, that is entirely fine. If you don't like this customization stuff and prefer a more guided experience, there's also a bunch of recommended traps the game puts down in a list for you, so you can just pick those. Now, most of the video, my trap choice is looking kinda dull, and there's a good reason for that. One of the features from Kagero that I wished they explored more, because the opportunities were fairly minor and required a lot of dedicated traps, saw a lot more use with these new systems in Deception 3. Room traps. Almost every room in the game has more than 2 room-specific traps that you can shove, push, launch, or trap people into. Some of them are single-use, some of them you can reuse after a while. Others are working independently from you and just require a little nudge to get someone stuck in them. I rarely felt wanting for traps because there's so much you can do in this game with just a wall push and a launcher. The increased number of room traps really helps solidify each room in every area as its own thing, a lot more than the rooms in Kagero did. Your surroundings actually feel like they matter more now, and with a game series that very much focuses on finding strategies to deal with situations, that's a very good change in general. This is also supplemented by enemies having special stats a lot more often. While they don't give themselves small intros or matter in the story anywhere near as much as they did in the previous 2 games, often just showing up as fodder, ready to be massacred, enemies tend to have more special properties to them. Some are immune to launchers and will just jump over them. Others are more likely to deflect projectiles. Some enemies are immune to fire. These things already happened in Kagero, but a lot more sparingly. In Deception 3, this is all very common and happens with multiple enemies every stage, which also means that you need to have a good variety of different types of traps ready to go, making that higher degree of customization matter more. Every stage also throws a larger amount of enemies at you in general, with more variety between them, making each individual stage last about twice as long as they did in Kagero, despite the game largely moving at the same pace. It's not lasting longer due to number padding or tedium, it's lasting longer because there's just more to the stages in general. So all of these changes are things that I'm happy to see gameplay-wise. There's also a dodge roll that seemed fairly useless at first, but turned out to have some good iframes on it that helped me get past some of the more aggressive enemies later in the game. I also quite like how the cooldown timers are displayed on the HUD this time around, with little pentagrams being drawn to represent how long it takes for them to be used again. It's surprisingly easy to make sense of this at a glance. Though I have to say that I'm less happy with the player's HP bar being a piece of glass that shatters as you take damage. While you can generally get an idea of how much health you have left and whether or not you're in danger, I often struggled making sense of how much damage you take from some hits, which makes it more difficult to get a sense of the level of urgency in a lot of situations. You want to avoid damage as much as possible, obviously, but sometimes tanking a hit or two to keep people in a trap's range makes more sense for a situation. like when you're really close to your opening trap being off cooldown and they're right in the range of it. And not being able to see how much health you have exactly gets in the way of this. Still, it's not like it's impossible to gauge just how much HP you have left and if you should start running for one of the restore crystals on a map. But when attacks do different amounts of damage, it's very hard to make sense of how much damage was exactly done to you if you're not at full health. Much like the previous titles, there's an emphasis on replays as there are multiple endings. 4 of them this time around. Though unlike the previous games, they no longer happen because of how missions play out, as there are no longer enemies that you can just let go, so it's all down to the few dialogue choices that you get in cutscenes. On one hand, this does make it easier to choose what ending you're going for, but on the other, it's a shame that it's simplified to this degree. On the bright side, the game has a New Game Plus feature, so you can continue experimenting with newer traps as you cycle back to your other endings if you want. Content doesn't stop at New Game Plus either, as Deception 3 also includes a 100-stage expert mode. This kinda comes down to a puzzle mode, where you have to clear stages based on special objectives rather than getting kills. It's a good way to enforce experimentation with traps and putting both the larger variety of them to use, as well as testing your ability with them. After the last 2 games were a lot more questioning towards the morality of killing, it does feel a bit odd for an arcade-like gameplay-focused edition, but honestly, I'm okay with it. This difference in focus might be what caused the split between professional reviews that I've seen and the feelings of fans of the series. As this is really the entry you're going to play if you like the gameplay, rather than wanting to experience the story. While I do have some problems with the story being lackluster and uninteresting compared to the other titles, the improvements made to the gameplay in terms of variety, the amount, and depth helps overshadow these issues for me. Do I recommend Deception 3? If you haven't played any of the other Deception games before, it kinda comes down to what you prefer. If you want that stronger narrative focus, you're better off starting with Kagero. If you favor gameplay, Dark Delusion is the way to go. If you've played Kagero and you're wondering if Dark Delusion is worth your time, I can assure you that it absolutely is. I can see myself replaying this one the most if I'd ever revisit the PlayStation 1 titles. And that's the end of Deception on the PlayStation 1. It's been a very interesting experience playing these games, that's for sure. Every entry is pretty unique in what they aim for compared to the others. Originally, I only really had interest in Kagero, but I'm glad to have experienced all 3 titles instead. The first was a really cool game because of how impressive a lot of the concepts and theming were for its time. The second gave a much better thematic piece that played with darker themes exceptionally well, and the third is a much more involved game mechanically. Though, things didn't end here. Reina had a costume in a DLC pack for Dead or Alive 5, much like Millennia had her representation in that series as well. And there's still 2 more entries to follow after this, Trapped on the PlayStation 2 and Deception 4 on the PlayStation 3 and 4, both being very, very different beasts from the games I've covered so far as well, but we'll get to that soon enough. Anyway, this was AboveUp, and yeah, I skipped the last video slot. I hope nobody is angry about this. I just needed time to myself to actually catch up on stuff, because the last time I took a break, I didn't really take a break. I was still doing video stuff this entire time, and this time I actually disengaged and just did stuff for myself. I caught up with a whole bunch of stuff that I've been meaning to since the start of the year. I have not been catching up with manga at all this year, and I finally have done that. We should be covering a few more interesting games soon. I've been testing emulators a bit. A few of the games that I wanted to test didn't really work well with the emulators that I had, and all of that is resolved right now. As always, this video is brought to you by people supporting me on Patreon. If you would like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen right now, head over to patreon.com/aboveup, and I will see ya.